All right, and we are live. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's Casual Conversations in Cybersecurity. We're really excited to be speaking with Jeff Mann on compliance. And Jeff, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Well, thank you. My name is Jeff Mann, as you said. I sort of have multiple roles in our world these days. My day job is I'm what's called a qualified security assessor, or a QSA, doing a specific kind of compliance called PCI. It's focused on credit and debit card security.
Okay.
It's a love-hate relationship, as many things are in the security world. But I've been doing PCI off and on for as long as it's been about. Actually, before it's been about since about 2004. So 16, 17, almost 18 years. That's my day job. I've been in what we used to call the information security world almost 40 years. I date myself back to 1982, where I had a job while I was in college working on a mainframe terminal accessing a database, and of course I was poking around seeing whose records could I look up. It was a student loan collection agency for a state government. I'm like, oh, are my friends and professors in here? And looking back on it, it's like, I was hacking. I was going places where I wasn't supposed to go, type of thing. My formative years were at the National Security Agency. I was there for about 10 years, mid 80s to mid 90s. It was while I was there that the internet kind of became a thing, and internet, we first called it internet security, protect your company when you're plugging in to the internet and going online, which it's, now what we call cybersecurity commonly. But I was there at the beginning and was part of a group at NSA that was trying to, we'd seen this movie called Sneakers, and we thought, oh, that's kind of cool. We should test the security of networks by breaking into them. So we started doing that. So we're credited, this small group of people that I worked with being the first NSA Red Team. Cool. And in the folklore, we're known as the Pit. So that sort of gives me street cred in the hacker security community. But I've been around long enough. I've been in the private sector for 25 years and mostly working with companies trying to figure out how to make security work. And for many of those years, it's been in the context of compliance. And that's why it's hard for me to have a conversation about security without bringing up PCI, which makes people yawn and groan and roll their eyes. But we stick to it and get through it, because I think personally PCI has been one of the most influential regulatory programs in the world. Even though it's private, it's a voluntary thing, and it's not a government regulated thing, which is part of the problem and part of the good thing of it specifically. So that's me in a nutshell.
So you've actually gotten to really see the whole evolution, birth and evolution of security from the beginning, which is pretty fascinating. And with the PCI, can you give us just a quick, broad understanding of compliance in general with regards to security, and then a little more into the PCI? I would love to understand that a little bit better.
Sure. Well, compliance, by definition, is a way to measure. It's a method for measuring how well you're implementing security. Right. There's lots of programs out there. Some are more explicit, thou shalt do this, that, and the other. Others are more best practice recommendations, but all of them are intended to give you some sort of roadmap or some sort of guidance and a way to measure how well are we doing. Are we improving? Are we doing? Try to avoid using sports analogies, but in American football, there's blocking and tackling. There's the mundane stuff that happens in the middle of the field while all the superstars get to throw the ball and run the ball, that type of thing. So that's compliance essentially in a nutshell, and that's not often understood, but we'll come back to that in a minute. PCI specifically was started by the credit card brands, who all back in the early 2000s were getting frustrated that all of their credit cards were getting stolen by all of their retail merchant customers. And so they each individually came up with their own set of security standards that they wanted retailers and merchants to follow in order to be able to protect the security of credit card information. Because it's a as you probably are aware, it's a real pain if you get your credit card stolen. You have to get a new credit card, replacement costs, and so on and so forth. In 2004, they got together and decided, let's come up with one common standard rather than each of us have an individual standard, and thus gave birth to the payment card industry data security standard. Okay. In a nutshell, it is a compilation of here's what you should do from a security best practice perspective, fairly comprehensive, in my opinion, in terms of the overall breadth, and yet very open-ended in terms of the specifics. Like they say, you should have a standard for how to harden and configure the systems that you use, and it should be based on some respected, recognized industry standard. It doesn't specifically say you should follow the NIST cybersecurity framework, or you should follow CIS top 20 controls, or CIS benchmarks. You need to have something. And it's one of the funny, at least to me, it's a funny argument that I hear often from people that try to berate and poo-poo the idea of PCI or compliance is, well, it's too granular and therefore it doesn't keep up with the times. Technology is advancing. I'm like, well, you've obviously never read it, because it's actually very, in my opinion, very open-ended. It doesn't say, here's the specifics of what you should be doing to harden a system. It says, harden the system and make sure it's hardened in a consistent manner. So at a high level, PCI, which I think reflects a comprehensive security program, and we could argue that, but it says basically secure everything. There's 6 goals of PCI, and the first one is secure everything. I say, I don't know if this is an NSFW broadcast, secure your, fill in the word that starts with an S and ends with a T. The second major goal is you have data that's sensitive that you want to keep secret and protect it. The third element is everything you're doing, keep it secure. The fourth element is monitor the access of your users, limit access of your users, control access of users. Not everybody needs to have access to the keys to the kingdom and the crown jewels. The fifth element is what I like to call all the security stuff, all the penetration testing and vulnerability scanning, intrusion detection, file integrity monitoring, logging, monitoring of events and all that, all the security stuff. That's one of the goals. And then the final goal is everything that you're doing, write it down, put it in policies and procedures so it's repeatable, and keep it fresh and updated, and base it on a risk assessment. That's the 6 goals. When you boil it down to that, most people can't argue with, well, yeah, that's kind of common sense. That makes sense. Everybody should be doing that. The devil's in the details.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask was well, that sounds like, as someone outsider who gets a broad view of kind of lots of the different parts of the cyber world, that sounds like a lot of just what the cyber's trying to do in general, overall. So what is the nuance that sets apart PCI? The
nuance that sets it apart is if you're a company and you want to engage in commerce and allow your customers to pay with a credit card, you have to follow them. There is no ifs, ands, or buts.
Improve.
So it's voluntary, but voluntary is you don't have to accept a Visa card. You don't have to accept a card. So, and the one of the reasons why it came about, and this is not necessarily written down, but it's well understood, is the fear of the credit card brands back in the early 2000s was they didn't want government regulation. Everybody feared government regulation, so they wanted to keep the government out of their business, and so they came up with their own standard. Part of the reason was, like Visa, for example, at the time was a private company. So they didn't have to do all sorts of public filings of their financial records and so on and so forth. And you can imagine credit card companies make a boatload of money, and they didn't want regulation. They've since gone public and so on and so forth. But
that
I mean,
was my question. Why is there no streamlined, federal level, thing? But
well, because there hasn't needed
you're saying
to.
They took the bull by the horns first.
Yep, they were proactive, preemptive, and wanted to keep the government that's here to help out of their doorway. Now, so going back to sort of compliance in general, and what's where I see compliance as being important in the world, despite everybody, most companies I work with kind of grumble at the fact that they're made to do this kind of stuff. But ironically, in the past year or two, where there's been some pretty major breaches, at least worldwide, but obviously I'm focused more on the United States, North America, infrastructure is getting hit, civil governments, municipalities, so on and so forth. Organizations that are generally not well funded in the first place, and don't really do secure, and I don't mean this to be disparaging. They want to do security right, but they're very limited very often by funding and budgets and things like that, and they're handcuffed in that sense. But where compliance comes into play, and where a lot of people are clamoring in the public spectrum, is, well, all these companies, organizations, institutions, critical infrastructure, they need to do security, therefore they need to be regulated, therefore the government needs to step in. And most people will acknowledge that's the only way that security for a lot of these organizations in particular verticals are ever going to get to some sort of level that they have a reasonable chance of being secure. It's if they're regulated, essentially. So that's sort of the good and the bad, or the nice thing about compliance, and the not nice thing is people hate it, but then they acknowledge, well, that's the only way a lot of companies are going to ever get there. And that's certainly been my experience over the last 16, 70 years, in the 16 or 17 years in the retail merchant space from PCI. Most of the companies that I have worked with over the years are companies that, if it weren't for the fact that they were plugging into the internet to engage in commerce, they really didn't have much in the way of a security program, and therefore they didn't have any need to develop a solid security program and invest a lot in it. I mean, it's been a few years ago at this point, but when Home Depot was breached back in 2013, 14, the CEO of the time actually was quoted as saying, "Why do we worry about security? We sell hammers." And the answer to that question is, but you're dealing with millions and millions and millions and millions of credit cards that have value to the bad guys, and people like to do these things called commit fraud. And I've told my customers for years, look, you bitch and complain about having to do all this stuff, but you're engaging in technology, and you're using a technology in a way that greatly enhances your ability to generate revenue. If you're old enough to remember the old days of using a credit card, where you had to get out this physical device, they call it a knuckle buster, and they'd put it in with paper, and they'd run the thing over top, and it would imprint it. But then they also had to turn around and get on the telephone and call an operator, read off all the information, the card number, the sales number, and get an approval. That could take 8-10 minutes sometimes. Nowadays, you go up to the cash register, you're in the checkout line, you can put your card in while you're still running your groceries through, or whatever you're purchasing, and by the time you're done, the card's been approved, the payment's done, you're on your way. That user experience generates a lot of revenue for these retailers. And I was like, look, it's great that you can do that, but there's a cost to doing that, and part of that cost is security. And that's sort of a reality that not everybody embraces, but more and more people embrace that, okay, there is a cost to doing business on the internet. There's a cost of taking advantage of the tremendous technological advances that we have, not the least of which are these things these days, and how much commerce and life happens just from these things.
Really incredible.
So compliance comes in. I'm sorry. Compliance comes in where, people that are security professionals and know the right thing to do, but don't often get the chance to do it. Compliance is, at least I view it as an opportunity to look, this thing is making us do the right thing, and the right thing being very often just the fundamental blocking and tackling of security.
Now we actually have a question that kind of was going to tie in. I actually love compliance myself for my own Capital One days. But
what's in your wallet?
Exactly. But, we could score 100, right? And there would still be, then there was still the teller that stole the little bit of money or made a mistake or whatever, so there's a lot of things that compliance won't necessarily fix. And so that was, one of my questions. And then we have a question here. I'll show it on the screen. Nadia wanted to ask your view about how to apply creative compliance strategies which incentivize people to embrace cyber hygiene behaviors. So to do the right thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts on that is, at the end of the day, despite what people want to believe, security is not terribly sexy. There's nothing sexy about writing down what you do and turning it into a process document, and maintaining systems, having to patch and update and keep tabs on whether things are working or not. We haven't helped ourselves with all the technological advances and all the data that's flying on the internet these days in terms of monitoring activity and monitoring logs. We're kind of stuck with automation. I remember back in the days when you could actually look at the logs passing on your screen with your eyeballs. Those days are sort of long gone. To me, the way to make it creative, I don't know. You took the question away. I think the way to do it, at least what I've done in my career, is to just kind of explain it in a way, is the goal of your program. Get away from the jargon and just break it down into, this is basic stuff that you should be doing. It's common sense. It's not sexy and exciting until the breach happens and you have to, handle that. But if you explain it in a context that makes sense to people and they can understand their contribution, let's say, whether the things that they do or don't do, and just make it make sense to them, in my experience, that's the best way to move it forward. But that doesn't sell. That's not sexy for marketing strategies and trying to sell the next best thing. But which I acknowledge is part of the industry and part of what needs to be done. You have to invest in technology. You have to invest in what I like to call tools, what others would call solutions. But my attitude has always been, for my customers that are trying to figure out what to purchase, and where to invest and where to spread their scant resources, which everybody doesn't have enough to invest in everything that they want to. My goal is always to just make my customer an informed consumer. Give them the facts as best as I can. Give them the pros and cons. Evaluate. Well, you could do this, and then you're going to need to do this, and this is not going to happen. Or you can pay more or less and do different things. And whatever you do, that's the risk-based decision, and that's what you need to live with. But I think one of the big things that's misunderstood in our industry and in our world is the difference between being secure and security. One is a state that is somewhat mythological, in my opinion, where you get to the point where your entire infrastructure, your entire entity is impervious to attack. That largely doesn't happen. That largely doesn't exist. Security, on the other hand, is ongoing processes, ongoing activities. I describe it as a verb. It's something that you do. Compliance standards help you to measure how well you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing. But you're never done. Most secure organizations I've had as my customers over the years have been ones where there's people that sort of take it personally, and they're like, you're not going to get on my box. You're not going to attack my system. You're not going to get me. I take it personally, and I take responsibility for it. That doesn't necessarily scale, but that's sort of the the attitude that most companies need to have is just sort of the right kind of paranoia and insecurity and fear that I think I've done the right things. I think I'm monitoring the right things, but I don't know what I don't know. And so I need to reach out, and I need to trust in tools and technologies and outside experts, and just keep searching and keep digging and keep being slightly paranoid, not overly paranoid.
Right. And I think in addition to being paranoid, you can feel, I don't know if it's not empowered, but maybe even deputized to that you're a part of this. So then, you feel like it's more than a tick box. You feel like the ongoing, the continuing thing that it'll bleed over, because you're like, we do this because of this. And then you feel, I don't know how to say, maybe you feel important taking a part in security.
Well, empowered is probably a good word, or at least understanding, what little thing that you do, which is where most people are, how it fits into the whole.
Right, in the big picture, yeah.
I mean, I was a business major in college back in the 80s, and then even when I was getting into the government in the mid 80s, there was this thing that we used to call, I want to say it was called Theory J, and it was a style of management in companies that tried to do exactly what you're saying: involve everybody, empower everybody to understand how they fit into the the cog, where their role was. Assembly line production. Of course, that's all robotics these days, but back in the old days, there might be 100 people in an assembly line, probably more than that would build a car, and somebody's job is I just tighten this nut on this bolt, 10,000 times an hour, 8 hours, 10 hours a day. How do you get them to understand? No, that's a very precious and important bolt. So that nut needs to be tightened to the right thing. Otherwise the car is not going to go.
You're saving lives by tightening this bolt correctly,
right. And that's something, as I look back on, what I learned when I was, working for an agency whose literal job was security. And so it was all of our mission. And it wasn't just a thing off the side that's an enabler or a call center, but we're really selling widgets or, whatever it is. Back then, when I was learning this field, there was a culture in the company, in the organization, that everybody did know their part, and there were lots of seemingly meaningless, over the top details to security that do I have to do this? But and I was coming in young thinking, oh, this is silly. Well, why don't we do things better or do things differently? But everybody was sort of committed to a lot of physical control processes, a lot of physical security processes back in those days. But, and it wasn't that people did it without question, but they understood the overall mission. And that's something that I don't think has necessarily translated well over the years as technology has evolved, as many have come out of the DoD and come out of intelligence roles and gone out into the private sector. And part of it's our fault, those of us that have come out, for not pushing the message. Part of it is just the sheer force of everybody wants to just buy a product that's going to make them secure so they don't have to think about it, because it sounds so complicated and it's so foreign. Right. And trust me, there's a lot of complicated stuff to the technology that we're using today, and the way it is and has the potential for being abused. It's a real cat and mouse game. I grew up in the Cold War, constantly, and working for an intel organization sort of at the end of the Cold War. It was all about cat and mouse. We would build a device that was impervious to communications compromise, and they'd figure out how to defeat it, and then we'd have to build something better, and it would work for a while, and they would figure out how to defeat it. And of course that worked in both directions. So it was a constant game of, one-upmanship, doing something a little bit better. We've got more missiles than you, so we're stronger. That's hard to translate into the private sector when we're just selling widgets, we're just selling hammers, we're selling food, we're selling clothing. Why do we have to care about all these things? And that's just one element. Then you've got, infrastructure, which is ties into national security at some point. So there's a little bit of help, except for there's not the regulation and the compliance, largely specifically focused on cybersecurity. So it's problematic. There is no one size fits all, but
Right.
what I'm doing in the waning years of my career is just trying to educate people on what it all means and put it in a context that they can understand. Absolutely needs to be done with non-jargon. I gave a talk a couple years ago that was basically born of starting to go, after many years of just being off consulting, I'd started going to hacker security conferences, and I'd hear all these people, very smart, bright, intelligent people, get up and give talks about things are broken and things aren't getting better, and the problem is them and these guys and those guys and the muggles and the ordinary people, and we hackers, we know what's wrong. Why won't anybody listen to us? And at some point I was sitting there thinking, maybe the problem's you, because if you're so smart and you know all the answers, how come you're not getting the point across? It's not how come they're
Right.
not. How come people aren't hearing it? Your bosses and your clients. How come you're not getting it across to them? So
I'm not explaining it right.
Communication.
I pulled together a talk. I had to come up with a sexy title, and I called it "The Art of the Jedi Mind Trick." But it was basically, I had this long career, and I was like, people tell me that I'm good at what I do. People tell me they understand things a lot better by the time I'm done. What are the things that I do that make me good? And I tried to, sit down and just document what are the techniques that I use that I've learned over the years to try to help effective communication. It starts with everybody's selling something. So this is mostly persuasive speech, that any role we have within cybersecurity, we're all selling something. We're all trying to convince management to spend money, our employees, our customers, our users to change behaviors, do something different. That's all persuasive speech. So I listed a bunch of techniques, and then later on I'm like, okay, I'm sure this has all been figured out by academics long ago. So I actually looked up and found all the clinical terms for all the things that I was describing. And I'm sure it's not a comprehensive list. I came up with 7 or 8 or 9 things that try to foster and help people to get the point across in a way that people will change behaviors, make the decision to spend money, whatever it is, because everybody's selling something. Putting it in the context of security, of course, but it's it's persuasive speech. If you've ever taken a college speech course, look up your textbook. It's persuasive speech, and there are pretty tried and true techniques. Removing the jargon is one of them. It's actually not dumbing down, because that implies that the people you're talking to are stupid, but speaking in their language. So you have to learn their language, learn what their frame of reference is, what their context is, and put what into a context that they can understand.
Right.
Simply, and I just call that learning their language. How do you do that? One of the very first important things to me for effective speech is listening. If I'm listening to you talking, I'm learning about you. I'm learning what your language is. I'm learning what your, what you care and don't care about, what you're passionate about, what your hot buttons are. I tell stories, analogies. That's part of that communication. Trying to put something in a context that people understand by making it absolutely non-jargon, but giving something as a reference point. And how do you get to know what the reference point is that's going to appeal to people? It's by listening to them, and listening is visual and as well as verbal.
Right. And there's so much, and the challenge I think is that, different segments have different, ways that you have to communicate, and you're constantly having to adapt your message. And I think that's one of the challenges, if I can say as an outsider, that I see cyber professionals is they have so many segments of people they've got to try to relate to and get in their shoes to be able to communicate the need in a way that's relevant to them.
I'm going to step on toes perhaps, but I think that's true of humanity.
Yes.
And it's largely due to the technological advances and the fact that, nowadays I type with 2 thumbs, whereas I used to type with 10 fingers, and somehow that's advancement. And that's innovative. But I think we are challenged as humanity because we have lost the ability to communicate. We've lost interpersonal communication skills. We've lost the ability to read people, read body language, read facial expressions, micro expressions, and things like that. Not completely, but I talk to young people. This talk I gave, I turned into a workshop, and I gave it several times. And I was challenged by young people to communicate by text and emoji. And they're like, "Oh, well, I just convey my emotions through the emoticons." I'm like, maybe that's a new language I need to learn. And I'm a grumpy old man, and I don't want to. But the challenge is, how do you read nonverbal cues in a text? I think the answer is you don't.
That's why people fight a lot over text. There never had to be a fight.
But the problem's solved because now we communicate by short video clips, and everybody's
voice
doing
notes
it.
And
do you have
grumble.
Do you have a link to one of those talks? I'd love to include it in the comments of this thread and see it myself, actually.
Yeah, I can certainly send you the links after. The ultimate, it started as a talk, it became a workshop. Ultimately, I put it in the form of a short course that is offered for free by a company called cybrary.io. It was there for a long time, and then it went behind their paywall. But I've been talking to their CEO over the last couple months, and I got them to agree to make that course freely available again. You do have to have an account. So fair warning, free account doesn't mean you have to pay for it. But to get to my training course, which it's like 12 5-minute videos, so it's maybe just a little bit over an hour, and it teaches you how to be an effective communicator.
That sounds fabulous. Yeah, I'd love to get that for myself, and also we can link it.
I can certainly share it with you, so you can put it up on your page.
Yeah, thank you. And well, I know we're right at time. Do you have just one last thing of speaking on communication? Maybe one thing that you see that maybe marketers miss, or they're doing well in communicating around the topic of compliance.
I'm going to be hard pressed to come up with something that's being done well, because one of my many pet peeves in our industry, and unfortunately it starts with marketing, and it's not malicious intent, certainly, but there's a lot of jargon in our industry that when I do this often, especially in the former times when we go out to conferences, when I pin people down on what do you mean by what you're saying, very often they don't have a good explanation. And I'm talking basic terms like vulnerability, threat, risk, and even the granddaddy of them all, security. Ask somebody to actually define that term, and doesn't matter who I talk to, very, very often they're very challenged. It's especially marketing programs across our industry drive the language, drive the jargon largely of our industry. And while that's good in many ways, it's a huge responsibility. So all I would ask and encourage marketers to do is at least have a definition for the terms that you're using. It doesn't have to be the right definition, but have a definition for the context that you're trying to have your conversation in. And obviously marketing produces scripts for salespeople and stuff like that to use. Do better, give more context, give more meaning, and be prepared to explain and define the terms, because I might meet you sometime and ask you these questions.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you so much. Well, we really appreciate you, Jeff, coming on and sharing really great information, interesting stories, and I'm really look forward to getting the resources from you as well. So thank you so much, and I hope we'll get to have another conversation in the future.
All right. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks.